Hey, welcome back to our study of Mark. Over the last 3 weeks, we've examined this book Mark wrote, and in the first kind of 2 weeks, we stopped and looked at the first half of this gospel. In week 1, we saw the introduction. Why did Mark write it? Who did he write it to? How does he introduce this Jesus, and why does Jesus matter? And in week 2, we looked at the primary message that Jesus preached for his ministry. And we saw how he preached the kingdom of God had come. In week 3, which was last week, we had a look, has Mark paused. He paused, this kingdom of God has come and stuff. He paused and he responded to a question that had been asked throughout the book so far. This question of why does it matter? Why is Jesus important? And this week, we're actually going to take a look at the whole purpose of this book. See, starting at chapter 8, Mark's gospel takes on a new slant. It draws attention to this coming suffering Jesus will endure at the cross. Some people have said that the book of Mark is actually a passion narrative with an extended introduction. In other words, it's all about this moment. And so for today, we're actually going to talk about this cross, this resurrection, the suffering of Christ, and why it matters. And starting in chapter 8, beginning with 3 prophecies, Jesus starts pointing towards his death. Mark 8, 31 to 33, Mark 9, 30 to 37, and 10, 32 to 34 are each revelations of the submission and humility Christ will need in the coming suffering that he's going to face. But Mark does this really weird thing. He pauses for a minute after each of these accounts and shows the response of the disciples, and he shows them being prideful. So first of all, we see Peter, and Jesus is like, I'm going to die, it's going to be bad. And Peter has the audacity to rebuke Jesus and be like, no, you won't. And, obviously that doesn't go well for him. And then the disciples, after the second one, start to argue about who is greater. After Jesus literally just said, I'm going to die and resurrect, they start arguing who is greater. And then finally, James and John, after the third one, seek to be seated in the highest seats of honor in heaven. And so it's just this strange introduction to the coming events that Mark's gospel is centered around. But it's actually really, really insightful. So over the last few weeks, we've discovered how Mark's gospel was actually centered around a bunch of Christians in Rome who were suffering. And what we've seen is they were suffering because they were a part of a culture that didn't really like and didn't really understand Christianity. And I'd say it's an experience that's quite relatable to us today. We live in a culture that at times really doesn't like our faith, and at most times doesn't really understand our faith. But they'll be quick to tell you they do. So we've seen how Mark portrays Jesus, right, and his life as an answer to this suffering. And how this suffering is rooted in a deeper issue of sin, which Jesus stepped in and rescued us from the power of. And offered us a place in a new way of living, a heavenly kingdom, a kingdom of wholeness. And then last week we saw how hard it is to accept this kingdom in our lives and our hearts until we've paused to know who Jesus is and come to trust his power and his intentions. And all of what we've looked at so far actually leads and builds into this one collection of events. A narrative of Christ's passionate love for humanity, for us. Where Jesus makes sacrifices that are frankly beyond our understanding, that he can actually do the work that brings this kingdom of wholeness into centrality and do away with the things that keep the kingdom of brokenness reigning above us. But what does all this got to do with Jesus' closest followers in response, their pride in response to Christ's prophecy of his coming cross and suffering? And how does that answer the bigger question of Mark, the suffering of Christians? It's actually in Jesus' responses to these pride statements that we begin to glean and understand why Mark would follow each passion account with these pride accounts. First, we got Peter, right? Who's like, Jesus, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not going to happen. And Jesus replies to him and says to him, hey, you're being earthly minded, be heavenly minded. Get out of your own bubble of importance. Stop using your two eyes, your 2 ears, your senses as the governance of truth. And then Jesus goes on when the second prophecy happens, and the disciples are arguing about who's the best, who's greatest, who's the one of highest esteem. And Jesus is like, yo, man, you have got this order wrong. You have got the pursuit wrong. It's those who make themselves last that will be first. Jesus picks up a child, puts him on his leg, and is like, yo, there is a social hierarchy that we have, children at the bottom, women, it's like some really awful things in the hierarchy in the way we see one another. If you're wealthy, you're higher than if you're poor in importance. And just like, you've got this backwards. It's broken. It is wrong. He who makes themselves last will be first. And then to the final bit of pride response to the final prophecy, where James and John are begging to be like esteemed above all, Jesus says, hey, you've misunderstood the goal of what we're doing here. That he who wants to be greatest, he's got to be slave of all. We've come to serve and not to be served. And the cool thing about Jesus' responses is they actually paint a picture of Jesus' own heart and his own character. See, Jesus sees a bigger picture than our human eyes have the capacity to see. He views our salvation as more important than his rights or his comfort. And he came with the authority of a king and yet the posture of a servant. And in other words, Jesus says this: everything you think you know, every part of the world order that you understand, flip it. It's wrong. And this is to the people who should be most far ahead. This is to his disciples, his closest followers, the people who have been behind him every day for years. And even they had it backwards. And what it does is paint this picture, this contrast, this divide between us and Jesus. It shows that he alone is capable of redeeming us and paying the cost of our failures. He alone has the comprehension, the sacrificial nature, and the selfless humility to rescue us from the brokenness and deliver us into a kingdom of wholeness. So then Jesus goes to Jerusalem, knowing he's going to die there, and he continues to reveal this beautiful kingdom of God in preaching, in miracles, in restorations, in healings, in bringing wholeness to brokenness. Until finally his prediction begins to come true, right? He's betrayed, he's humiliated, he's tortured, he's persecuted beyond despair. And once all humanity had thrown all it had at him, the evils of death and beyond that we know next to nothing about took their turn to come at him. But with each prediction of suffering came a promise of resurrection. And sure enough, we jump into Mark chapter 16. After Jesus suffered, he had died, and all this has happened, and we start to see this tale of resurrection. What's wild is only half the chapter was written by Mark. But because he ended it so abruptly, so suddenly, it was uncomfortable for readers, and a conclusion was tacked on, scholars believe, later on. See, the way Mark abruptly ends his gospel is with this: a heap of women discover Jesus alive and resurrected. And then he writes down in verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid. But the thing is, an abrupt ending is usually indicative, right, of the author trying to incite the reader's imagination. He's trying to get them to place themselves in the story. And he's doing it with this intent to force them to ask themselves a question. The woman said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Hey, what are you going to do? So we jump back to that story, like the disciples responding to prediction of Christ coming suffering with pride. And we hear Mark's challenge echoed louder than ever. What are you going to do? Will you, like Peter, keep your eyes on worldly things? Will you trust in your senses alone and let them govern what you will believe, what you will do, what you will experience, what you will stand on? Or will you let them drift to heavenly senses, spiritual senses? Hey, what are you going to do? Will you, like the disciples, have your priorities out of whack and continue the competitive and divisive spirit of sin by striving after personal greatness? Or will you humble yourself, putting aside your comfort, your rights? Hey, what are you going to do? Will you, like James and John, make the gospel about your esteem and your gain and use it to accumulate whatever greatness you can? What are you going to do? And this Mark's echo, Mark's question, posed to the Roman church in the midst of persecution and suffering, echoes so profoundly to our church and each of us today. What are we going to do? See, when Jesus was found resurrected, the game changed. Everything changed. Because if he could conquer death, fulfilling not only his own 3 prophecies, but 1,500 years of biblical prophecies, right? It's hard to take seriously any doubt about anything else he said. If death itself was conquered and triumphed over by this man, then what is there left to stand in his way? If he says the kingdom of the living God is here and accessible, restoring, redeeming, available to all, replacing brokenness with wholeness, then what's left? If that's all true, and the resurrection has been witnessed and so is true, the only thing left is how we're going to respond. So Mark's abrupt ending, asking this simple question, what are you going to do? He's essentially summarizing this. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's scary. No, it doesn't all make sense. But Christ is alive. What are we going to do about it? Will we run away afraid and say nothing to anyone? Or might we boldly raise up, proclaiming this truth to as many people as will listen? Over the last 4 weeks, we've discovered in this gospel this narrative that runs through. And in some way it says this, yeah, I get it, it's scary, man. People will shame you. You're a Christian, dang, people are going to find opposition to you. People will likely mock, disown, ostracize, turn on you, spread lies, spread rumors, just because you're living authentically to your Christian faith. But every part of that persecution is a part of a deeper brokenness, a brokenness that is literally wrecking lives. And as we experience being persecuted, wrecking the lives of the people, broken people interact with. But Jesus is the answer. Jesus brings about a new kingdom. Jesus is our hope. Jesus is their hope. Jesus is our strength to boldly proclaim, to boldly approach and share the gospel, to boldly stand where others might falter, to boldly love enduringly, to reveal a kingdom of wholeness to all lost in brokenness. And that's the coolest part of Mark's gospel, this narrative that sews together. Jesus is our hope to see a heavenly way as we submit to the Spirit and keep disciplines that stretch and grow our spiritual senses. Jesus is our hope to end the competitive spirit of people and stand up for harmony, prosperity, community as a people imaging God. Jesus is our hope to no longer need to strive for our own glory, rather leaving that in his hands because we know he loves us and cares for us. And the reason he's our hope is because he rose again, because he changed everything. He demonstrated his love, his power, and his victory. So who else should we turn to for hope, wholeness, or healing? Only Jesus can, and only Jesus is willing to, and only Jesus has paid that cost. And so there we have it, the challenge of Mark's gospel. Today we flip it all around, turn the world we understand upside down. Everything we know is wrong. Let's make our life's mission about serving one another, about considering ourselves least before a world in desperate need of Jesus. Let's have heavenly eyes and hold fast to the faith that there is more at play right now than our comfort and our rights. Because what Mark was asking his persecuted audience is today what I believe Jesus is asking us. What are we going to do with the hope that Jesus has given us?